Apple just released 2 new iPads. One of them, the basic 10th generation iPad, was rebuilt from the ground up. The new iPad Pro, on the other hand, is a much simpler update. The company took last year's model, swapped the M1 chip for the M2, made a few other small tweaks, and called it a day. The iPad Pro is still ludicrously fast, and it's still extremely expensive, starting at $799 for the 11-inch model and $1099 for the 12.9-inch. I can't really fault Apple for this approach though. Even though the basic design of the iPad Pro was first introduced in 2018, it's still a marvelously engineered piece of hardware. It features one of the best screens Apple has ever made, and it continues to surprise me that the company can pack so much power into such a compact frame. While this year's model closely resembles what Apple was already selling, it does arrive at a significant time for the iPad's evolution. That's thanks to iPadOS 16, which launched a couple weeks ago. For most iPads, it's the expected collection of useful improvements, but for the iPad Pro, it offers an entirely new multitasking system called Stage Manager. It's a clear response to the question we tech reviewers and many iPad Pro owners have been asking for years. When will we get software that lets us take advantage of the iPad's power? First, a quick refresher. The iPad Pro is still available in 2 sizes, 11 and 12.9 inches. Storage options range from a modest 128 gigabytes up to a truly outrageous 2 terabytes. And you can configure it with an optional 5G radio for when there's no Wi-Fi. And for when you're at home, it supports the Wi-Fi 6E standard, whereas last year's model was limited to Wi-Fi 6. The fit and finish remains exceptional, and while the 1.5-pound weight makes it a bit more of a burden to hold compared to smaller and lighter iPads, I'm still impressed at Apple's ability to cram such performance into a device that's so compact. There are other well-designed tablets in the market, but I still don't think anyone has caught up to the iPad Pro. There's nothing new about the Liquid Retina XDR display this year, but it's worth highlighting just how good it is. It uses mini LED backlighting to offer 2600 local dimming zones to offer a wide dynamic range and a 1,000:1 contrast ratio. Both iPad Pro models also have the 120Hz ProMotion refresh rate, support for the P3 wide color gamut, a screen that's fully laminated to the front glass, and an anti-reflective coating. Just like last year, the iPad Pro has an ultra-wide 12-megapixel front-facing camera that supports Face ID authentication. Unfortunately, the iPad Pro still has that camera on the portrait edge of the screen, which means you're always going to be somewhat off-center and not looking directly at the screen if your iPad is in a keyboard dock and you're on a video call. This has been true of all iPads for years now, but now that the basic model has gotten a landscape-oriented camera, we're going to be waiting impatiently for Apple to implement that feature across its entire lineup. The back cameras are also the same. There are 12 megapixel wide and 10 megapixel ultra-wide options, along with a flash and LiDAR scanner. However, the M2 processor unlocks a new video trick, as the iPad Pro can now record video in Apple's ProRes codec at 4K resolution and 30 frames per second. This feature was first introduced in the iPhone 13 Pro. It's admittedly something of a niche feature, but it shows off the M2's improvements over its predecessor. From an accessory standpoint, the iPad Pro uses the same 2nd generation Apple Pencil and Magic Keyboard that have been available since 2018 and 2020 respectively. The Magic Keyboard still provides the best typing experience you can find on an iPad, though the whole package is pretty heavy. And again, it's also crazy expensive. The M2 on the new iPad Pro enables a new Apple Pencil trick called Hover. If the pencil is within 12 millimeters of the screen, icons and interface elements can react to it. The most simple example is how app icons on the home screen increase in size when you hover the pencil over, showing you what you're about to tap on. This works system-wide, at least in Apple's apps. Third-party developers will have to build hover features into their own apps, but it should be a nice tool in the Pencil's arsenal. One place I was able to demo it was in the Notes app. When using the new watercolor brush, you can hover the pencil over the screen and see how the color will react with other elements that you've already drawn. I found another cool hover implementation in the excellent image editing app Pixelmator Photo. Hovering and moving the pencil across a strip of different filters at the bottom of the app automatically applies them as a preview. It's wicked fast, and it's a fun way to see what your picture will look like when you're done editing. But let's get to that M2 processor, shall we? Thanks to our review of the M2 MacBook Air earlier this summer, we had a good idea of what to expect here. And running some benchmarks confirmed that the M2 iPad Pro is modestly faster at single-core tasks and more significantly improved in multi-core and GPU tests. More anecdotally, I felt absolutely no performance hiccups no matter how I used the iPad Pro. But I also felt the same way about the M1 model. If you regularly push an M1 iPad Pro to its limits and use it in a setting where your time equals money, These improvements might justify upgrading, but unless your workflow is extremely demanding, you can probably skip this generation. When you consider the fact that the iPad Pro's basic design hasn't changed since 2018, that's another reason to hold off. It wouldn't surprise me if Apple released an all-new Pro in the next year or so. Finally, there's the not-so-small matter of iPad OS 16, and more specifically Stage Manager. As a reminder, Stage Manager lets you have up to 4 apps open in one group, with overlapping, resizable windows. For other groups, with up to 4 apps in each, show up on the left side of the screen based on how recently you've used them. Only a select few iPads can run Stage Manager thanks to some stringent hardware requirements, but this new M2 model is naturally one of those. Ever since Stage Manager arrived in the beta versions of iPad OS 16 earlier this year, there's been a lot of chatter amongst the iPad faithful about Apple's execution. My experience hasn't been bad, but it does feel like new software going through some major growing pains. There are probably too many different ways to do things in Stage Manager, like adding a new app to a group. Window management is more restrictive compared to a Mac or Windows or Chrome OS, and the behavior of the control strip on the left side of the screen remains a bit confusing. Stage Manager feels like a work in progress, but when it works, I've created app groupings that make me a lot more efficient and productive than when I was using the iPad's standard 2-app split view multitasking mode with a third app off to the side in a slide over window. And while Stage Manager was, and still may be, buggy, I at least have run into a lot fewer problems here on the M2 iPad Pro with the final iPad OS 16.1 release. I think the experience is worth spending a day or two with to see if you can find your flow. There's no question that the new iPad Pro is better than its predecessor. It's the same price and comes with a more powerful chip as well as a few additional features. That said, I think it's not as sure a bet as the last iPad Pro was when it came out in early 2021. That's primarily because of the iPad Pro's design, which has remained essentially unchanged for the last 4 years. That's good news in some ways, because you could have bought an Apple Pencil in 2018 or a Magic Keyboard in 2020 and still use them with the M2 iPad Pro. But at a certain point, probably not too long from now, Apple will advance the iPad Pro's form factor yet again. Not that it necessarily needs to. The iPad Pro remains well designed and continues to be a standout performer, as it should be for the price. But that landscape edge front camera on the 10th generation iPad tells me that we'll see an iPad Pro before long with a more substantial redesign, and not just one with a faster chip inside. Thanks for tuning in, and stay tuned to Engadget for more reviews and videos.